Welcome. In this video, we will continue our study of the French Revolution by examining how the revolution takes off from a revolt by the nobility and the bourgeoisie to becoming one more embraced by the sans-culottes and the lower class, the urban poor of France, and it devolves into the Terror. We left off last time as the National Assembly had sworn an oath to meet and write a new constitution for France. Other events in 1789 is that the Estates General, we already talked about how they became the National Assembly. A terrible fear swept through the peasantry of France that same year. There started a pernicious rumor that was false that the nobility were going to hire foreign armies to come and just massacre the peasants as some weird way to end the revolution. As a result, the fear among the peasants led them to spontaneously and all over France storm the manor houses of the French nobility and ransack them and terrorize them and devastate them. Of special attention were the documents that sort of proved what peasants owed to their feudal lords, the annual payments they had to make, and those were particularly destroyed. That led to a sentiment of instability in France in 1789. Furthermore, the food shortages or famine continued to grow, and there was a spontaneous march of many of the poor women of Paris out 12 miles to the suburbs of Paris at Versailles, where Louis was, they banged on the gates till they were let in, and they confronted and accosted Louis and Marie Antoinette and forced them to come back to live at a slightly less glamorous palace, at the old palace at the Tuileries in downtown Paris, where the mobs could keep a better eye on them rather than being out in the burbs. Similarly, around this time was the storming of the Bastille. Again, a mob formed and busted down the gates to the Bastille, a royal prison in Paris that held very few actual prisoners at this time, but was a symbol of royal power. And this July 14th of 1789 is a symbolic sort of revolution day that is emblematic of the start of the revolution. Well, with Louis showing no zeal for his own power, and with the nobility and the clergy sidelined and the Estates General gone, the National Assembly itself simply begins to pass laws and govern France. It devolved into several factions, which today we would identify as kind of a relatively modern political spectrum. Here we see from the left to the right, within the chamber, it simply happened that people who agreed with one another tended to sit together, so that on the left, it just so happened that the more radicals sat together, the more conservatives sat together, and the moderates were left kind of in the middle to balance them out. Left outside of the chamber, not represented directly, were the urban poor, the sans-culottes, those who would most resort to mob rule and violence, are looking in the windows and banging on the doors sometimes, and presenting kind of a threat to the revolutionary government. Another threat to the revolutionary government were the émigrés, the ultra-conservatives, who wanted to undo the revolution and put Louis back into his full power and undo all of this. But then within the chamber, there were disagreements. The leftists on the left were the radicals. They wanted a full republic, a republican form of government, indirect democracy, a representative democracy with universal male suffrage. On the right were the conservatives, who simply said, this is good enough. Let's not press our luck. Let's not ruin what we have gained by angering more factions. We've already made more radical change in France than we've seen in centuries. Revolution over. This is good. And then you had some in the middle who simply said, perhaps we haven't gone far enough, but we're not going to get rid of the king and do universal male suffrage, but we also don't think the revolution's over. We're open to some changes in reforming our new limited monarchy, but not undoing it entirely. And this is in some sense, the modern political spectrum that some of the terms are still applicable today. What else do? They begin passing laws based on their understanding of the Enlightenment philosophes, and their rallying cry is liberté, fraternité, égalité, liberty, fraternity, equality. liberty or freedom, fraternity, a sense of brotherhood, a sense of all being in it together, and equality, the idea that distinctions, especially distinctions of class, such as the three estates, were unjust and should be done away with. Some of the famous documents of the National Assembly are the Declaration of the Rights of Man, inspired heavily by the Enlightenment, inspired directly by Thomas Jefferson, and the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, and heavily on John Locke's definition of natural rights. As a rebuttal to the corollary to the rights of man, Olympe de Gouges wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman. And in it, she basically argues for all of these rights to be extended to women also. She was largely ignored and rebutted by many of the men in the assembly at the time. The assembly begins to pass for state control over the Catholic Church, the furthest extent of Caesaropapism, the idea that you have state control over the church, that the new revolutionary government would choose and appoint bishops and would pay the clergy and would sell church land and sell off and empty the monasteries and sell off their land in order to fund the government, which, if you recall, the thing that started it was that the government had no money. And so a new revolutionary government has an even harder time raising money than the king did, who had near absolute power to raise money. And if he couldn't do it, how are the revolutionaries to do it? So desperate to earn money, they look at the state looks at the church as a fatted cow for the slaughter that they can sell off its assets in order to fund the government. This is one thing that causes a major rift. You've already alienated the nobles and the clergy, but this begins to alienate the peasants. And so many peasants were quite loyal and faithful to the church, and this begins to alienate further people from the revolutionary movement, which is set to splinter again. But in 1791, they fulfill their tennis court oath to write a constitution in 1791 called the Constitution of 1791. They decide upon they want to imitate England. They want to imitate what the Baron de Montesquieu and his idea of the separation of powers with a limited constitutional monarchy, much like William and Mary had established in England roughly 100 years before in 1688, where they had the English Bill of Rights and they had limits, but you had a meaningful but powerful king, a meaningful, powerful but also limited parliament, and a meaningful independent court system. But by this declaration that his own people have declared Louis limited and not an absolute monarch, several other monarchs, notably that of Austria and other countries, declare war on France, not against Louis, but to restore Louis. And this is commonly known, that other countries are at war with France in order to put Louis back into full power in France. And many of the conservative émigrés, many high churchmen, nobles, and others who had emigrated or fled out of France were encouraging foreign countries to help restore them to full power, which is what directly leads to the downfall of the Constitution of 1791 in 1792. Didn't last very long. Some of the precipitating events. In September, there was a terrible massacre that was not just in one event, but swept over many areas of France, where many of the nobles and the clergy, priests and nuns and others, were murdered simply for who they were. They were seen, and remember, those who opposed the revolution the most had already fled France, and so many of the nobles and clergy who remained were somewhat optimistic that the revolution could still turn up something good, and there was a wave of violence against them as enemies of the revolution, because many of the nobles and clergy who fled France were decidedly against it and were raising armies to undo the revolution. This caused the remaining nobles and clergy to be suspect, and many of them became marked men and women in some cases. And that only encouraged more of them to flee the country, because simply being who they were put their lives at risk. It also just so happens there were terrible crop failures or famine, the food shortages. That was one of the things that had led to problems in the first place, and so you have terrible problems. Famine, food shortage, a weaker government, and they are at war. France is in the midst of a crisis. It's in the midst of this crisis and these wars that are sponsored by the other monarchs, other kings, and the own French immigrés that Louis himself makes a fateful decision to try to flee. And as he flees, it's called the flight to Varennes, where Varennes is where he's apprehended. He's trying to himself become an immigré. He is technically head of the government of France, and he decides to flee France in order to join up with other immigrés and monarchs of other countries to try to undo the revolution. He is very narrowly caught at the French border, declared not a friend and therefore an enemy of the revolution. And so now Louis and Marie are no longer just being watched in a slightly less luxurious palace. They're now in jail. But the government is facing pressure from all directions, and for fear of their own lives and their own necks and not willing to take responsibility, they submit to a new random set of elections in 1792 in which the assembly dissolves in the face of this mob pressure. And these new elections bring the extreme radicals to power, none more so than the Jacobin Political Club. It's not quite a political party, but we call it the Jacobin Political Club. They call for a full republic, abolition of the monarchy, to put Louis on trial, which they do, much like Charles I in England 150 years earlier. They put him on trial and execute the king by guillotine, much as many others in France had already fallen victim. Remember, this is called regicide, or the killing of a king. Those who sponsor it are forever marked themselves as regicides, those who consented to it, and therefore there's no coming back from that. There's no going back. Three very famous Jacobins are Maximilien Robespierre, the leader of the Terror. He was the leader of the Committee of Public Safety. The idea is that enemies of the revolution are a threat to public safety, and therefore they must be apprehended and dealt with, which means guillotined. Paul Marat, who had a terrible skin condition, so he actually almost lived in his own bathtub because it was the only thing. They didn't have medicines that would properly treat his skin disorder, so he spent like hours every day in a bathtub. But so he couldn't be a big revolutionary leader in person, but he wrote. He was a famous writer who wrote that what the revolution needed was a couple of thousand heads to roll, and then that's what would save the revolution. He himself was murdered by a fanatic who broke into him and killed him in his tub. Georges Danton, who actually lived and breathed and worked among many of the sans-culottes and was quite friendly with many of them and well known as a good speaker. He and Robespierre were like right and left-hand men for each other, but at one point Danton thought the Terror had gone far enough and that the emergency powers of executing people very hastily should come to an end. This caused Robespierre to break with him and to accuse him, Danton, of being an enemy of the revolution, and led to his execution. What is the Terror? Well, as we said, the Committee of Public Safety uses the will of the mob to enforce justice. Mainly in Paris and a few other large cities, they chose to use terror or fear of the people and fear of the threat of being guillotined. They declared themselves a republic of virtue, and virtue meant supporting the revolution, supporting the mob, supporting the terror. Rather than being a republic, they were closer to mobocracy. We have a democratic form of government where you have majority rule with minority rights, where even when you're in the political minority, you have certain rights. Mobocracy means majority rules, period, which means if 50% plus one of the people want you dead, then you die. And that is how the Terror operates. They get rid of virtually every vestige of the Catholic Church. Here's an image of the king being guillotined. Here's Robespierre. Here's eventually when the people turn on Robespierre. Here's a cool picture. You can pause it here if you like, of this new revolutionary calendar they come up with to get rid of all religious holy days, right? They have saints' days and Christmas and Sundays. And so they go so far as to change the entire calendar so as to discourage people from the celebration of their traditional holy days. They change calendar, they begin to worship reason, and again, it is total state control over religion. But the Terror does not solve problems. This mobocratic form of government does not solve the famine or food shortages. It certainly does not win the war, and in fact, they only make more enemies as they continue to execute more people and make war on the church. The fall of Robespierre, eventually the people turn on him, and that is where we will pick up next time with the fall of the Terror and the Thermidorian reaction that brings to rise Napoleon. Thanks for watching.